Hello and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Plan Eat Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with Food for You and the Planet. Today's episode features Tim Fink, Vice President of Policy at the American Farmland Trust. Tim develops the American Farmland Trust's overall policy direction and strategies and coordinates federal and relevant state policy work in close collaboration with American Farmland Trust national initiative leaders, regional directors, and partners. Before joining American Farmland Trust, Tim was the Director of Research and Policy Analysis at the Supporters of Agricultural Research Foundation, where he advocated for increases in USDA's Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, fundraised for the National Academies Science Breakthroughs 2030 project, and led the development of a series of Farm Bill research policy recommendations endorsed by 66 organizations. Tim has extensive experience in politics, including 5 political campaigns, and as a legislative assistant to the chair of the House Energy Committee for Iowa's General Assembly. Tim holds a master's degree from Harvard and a Bachelor of Arts from Luther College. Thank you so much for being here today, Tim.
Thank you so much for having me, Rosie.
So let's start off by learning a little bit about the American Farmland Trust. What is the American Farmland Trust and what type of work does it do?
Our goal is to keep land and farming and to keep farmers on the land. We often say that our mission is the land, practices, and people, by which we mean protecting our best agricultural land, supporting the adoption of sound farming practices, and ensuring that the people in the farming are really in a viable industry. And when we talk about these 3 facets of our mission, we don't see them as silos. Rather, we see them as intricately connected to one another. For instance, you're not going to see conservation investments unless that farm is viable enough to make those types of investments. We've also seen, for instance, that protected farms are much more likely to pick up those conservation measures. And so each aspect of this mission reinforces another. And what does this work look like at the ground level? We have staff working on programs like water, soil health, farmland protection. We have folks who are working directly with farmers and trying to get conservation practices on the ground. We have a dedicated research team. I head up our national policy team. In addition to that, we have 8 regional offices that are all doing work directly with farmers and also doing policy work at the state level.
How did you become interested in sustainable food and agriculture?
Well, you mentioned my undergrad, which was at Luther College in Northeast Iowa, so a really small liberal arts college. And living there really changed the trajectory of my career. Unlike most of Iowa, it's not flatlands. To be clear, I grew up in the flatlands. I have nothing against flatlands. But Northeast Iowa actually has a bunch of limestone palisade cliffs that go right by the upper Iowa River. And it's this landscape that's just so incredibly beautiful that it was under consideration actually to become a national park at one point. And it was in kayaking and hiking in those areas that I really found a love for the land and a love for the environment. And you cannot protect these things without partnering directly with agriculture. My senior thesis was concentrating on using easements to protect the land. It was focused on water quality. It actually sprawled in a million different directions, and I never expect that I'd be working in a place where I'd actually be working in all of those different facets all at once.
That's awesome. I love how your story led you to such a great career helping farmers. How does the American Farmland Trust work to protect land?
There's sort of 2 answers to that. On one side is programmatic, on the other side is the policy work that we do. So AFT was the first national agricultural land trust. That means that we still do conservation easements to permanently protect agricultural land from development. And that's especially in places where they may not have an existing land trust or places where there's not an existing state program. We're also involved in research on trends in agricultural land loss. The great example of this is our Farms Under Threat studies, specifically our Farms Under Threat State of the States report, which found that between 2001 and 2016, 11 million acres of agricultural land were lost or fragmented in ways that really does not work for agriculture. We're also helping farmers to access land, something that I think we'll get into a little bit later, but we're also doing the policy work to try to protect farmland. So that means advocating for farmland protection programs, making sure that they can protect that land for perpetuity, but finding all sorts of other ways to protect farmland in order and also keeping agriculture viable, which is absolutely essential if we want to see this land remain in agriculture.
What are some of the greatest challenges related to protecting American farmland?
There are so many. One is development. And when we look at that farmland loss study of 11 million acres lost, it's not actually high density. It's not your cities expanding out. It's actually low density that is the chief culprit in farmland loss. These are your farmettes, ranchettes, places that are essentially acreages. That is the primary culprit. In terms of permanent farmland protection funding, it costs money to pay for these easements and to compensate farmers for, essentially giving up a particular right. And we also need other tools. Viability of agriculture is absolutely key. According to the most recent census, the majority of farms in the United States actually run at a loss. It's off-farm income. It's the partner working at a different job that's actually helping to keep the farms afloat. And we often say that really it's a thriving agricultural business that's really the best thing for farmland protection. The other thing I wanted to mention was land access. This is the number one challenge facing new farmers when we start thinking about creating opportunities for them. In fact, only a quarter of agricultural land is sold on the open market, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about, the next generation issues as part of this conversation.
Yes, I would actually, yeah, I would love to hear more about that. How do you think that we could help preserve farmland and make sure that it transitions to the next generation?
So for us, farmland protection is actually a form also of supporting the next generation. So when you put a permanent easement on a farm, basically it's going to sell it as agricultural value rather than its development value. And so if this is land that's close to a city where a lot of new farmers want to be closer to their markets, that land is often the most affordable land. And when I say that land access is the number one challenge facing farmers, I mentioned there's only 25% of ag land that actually hits the open market. Most of it actually goes to people that inherit it. But these new farmers are facing greater competition than ever before. They have private investors, there's real estate developers, energy developers. You see larger warehouses and distribution centers, and increasingly you're reading in the news about data centers. That's been a huge issue in the state of Virginia where I live. Part of what we're doing too is looking at how do we help senior landowners with that transition as well, helping them to meet that next generation farmer, helping them to understand that they have options to create. And we're also thinking about ways to help transfer that land. Something that we often talk about is buy, protect, sell, where a land trust like AFT or a local land trust might buy a specific piece of property, put it under a permanent easement, and then be very intentional about selling that land, that cheaper land to that next generation farmer, and really kind of finding a way to directly get this into the next generation's hands. I mean, to give you a sense of where we're at, basically a third of all agricultural land is going to change hands in the next 15 years. And that's just because of the average age of farmers. So we're in the midst of a seismic shift of agricultural land. And the policies that we do now are really going to help to determine whether or not that remains in agriculture.
You've touched on this quite a bit, but how has the amount of land owned by small farmers changed in recent decades? Is this something that is happening more suddenly now, or has it been happening slowly over many years? How has this been changing?
Well, I want to answer this by a nerdy technical point, which is to say that USDA defines small farms by gross cash farm income. So they don't actually define it in terms of acreage, which is something that we're very curious about changing and having some clear definitions on that front. But between 2017 and 2022, we lost about 90,000 farms that were below 180 acres. And that's basically about 6%. But this is a trend that was happening across the board in agricultural land, in terms of farms, not just small farms. We're losing across the board about 7% of all farms. And some of this is due to land being converted, and some of that is due to consolidation. But I will say that small farms have been a focus for AFT. We've been advocating for USDA to create an office of small farms, specifically to make sure that we're providing really effective service to those communities, and even doing effective outreach to those communities. We're also interested in seeing advancement of local and regional markets, anything we can do to support those smaller producers, and also providing more business technical assistance, things like marketing planning, business planning, et cetera.
Are there any things that the average person could do to help conserve American farmland?
I think for one thing, support your local farmer. So, going to the farmers market, there's so many farm to table opportunities for so many people out there. Second is supporting your local land trust. And for many people, there is a land trust in their backyard specifically doing this type of work to protect the agricultural land base. I think a development team would not let me leave this conversation without saying supporting AFT. Take that as a given. But folks can advocate, and that is one of the most important steps, is to advocate for farmland protection and farm viability. And that's actually at all levels. Most of my time spent at the national level, but when you look at where a lot of the farm and land use decisions are, it's at the state and even the local level. Things like local zoning. They may not be sexy, but they're one of the best forms of farmland protection we have out there. So definitely encourage everyone to check out AFT, sign up for newsletters so that we can help provide you with some of those advocacy opportunities.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's really great to be able to support the work that the American Farmland Trust is doing, and I hope that some of the listeners can decide to do that. How does the American Farmland Trust advance farming practices that prevent erosion and rebuild soil health?
So much like I said with farmland protection, we have both a programmatic side of this and a policy component. So we're working directly with farmers on the ground. In some cases, we're helping to write conservation plans. We're holding educational events on this. For instance, we have a program called Women for the Land. This program does a lot of things, but one of the trends that we've seen in agricultural ownership is that there's a lot of what we call non-operating landowners. And a lot of these are in fact women that have inherited land and maybe have chosen not to go in the family business, but they're very interested in getting involved in conservation. So doing these types of trainings. And to give you a sense, if you look at the Midwest, the majority of agricultural land is actually rented. So tapping into this issue is very important to addressing conservation. And in some cases, we're providing farmer to farmer opportunities, helping farmers that are already doing practices connect and mentor other farmers in doing these. This is something actually we're interested in the federal level. We have a piece of legislation specifically to support more of this work, which is the perfect pivot I need to get on the advocacy side. So we're doing advocacy in all those different regions, trying to advance programs to this effect. And at the federal level, we're looking to increase conservation funding and also looking to establish a federal matching program for state soil health programs.
Why are practices that prevent soil erosion and rebuild soil health important?
We're fond of saying that for so many of these practices, great examples are cover crops or regenerative grazing. They benefit a triple bottom line. So that's a benefit for farmers, that's a benefit for the environment, that's a benefit for society. If you're a farmer, many of these practices are ultimately going to save you money over the long run. And it's going to make your operation more resilient to so much of the extreme weather you're seeing, whether that be drought or flooding. And for the public, what you're getting is improved, cleaner water. You're getting improved air quality. You're getting all of the climate benefits that come with these practices, whether that be reductions in greenhouse gas emissions or sequestration of carbon. And it also helps to protect and expand habitat. And that's part of the reason why some of our closest allies come from the wildlife hunting and fishing community.
How does the American Farmland Trust help keep farmers and ranchers in business? You've mentioned viability of these businesses. How do you work to help farmers stay in business?
We've been directly engaged with farmers at that ground level, holding all sorts of educational events. For us, conservation practices are a way to stay in business. We have so many studies showing that for $1 that contributed to these practices, they generate $3 in return if the farmer can make that long-term investment. We're also see farmland protection as a means of helping viability. So if a farmer does an easement, they receive, the proceeds of that easement, you see it go right back into the business. I'm thinking of a farmer that we brought out here to talk to members of Congress, and they took the proceeds from their orchard and actually invested it into then a cidery. And so that's the type of thing that actually radically improved that business. And we're also, again, supporting all sorts of policies to try to improve the lives of farmers. I mentioned that business technical assistance, making sure that there is a lot of support available, especially for those new farmers just getting their feet underneath them.
You've mentioned a lot of the work that American Farmland Trust does to help support farmers. What are some of the key quantifiable impacts the American Farmland Trust has had? Can you share some facts or statistics that you think share some of its impact?
So in 2024, our staff trained and supported about 32,000 farmers, ranchers, and landowners in a variety of different programs. We also do a lot of train the trainer type stuff and doing work with communities of practice. So add another nearly 13,000 individuals and professionals that we've been doing these types of trainings with. We've protected land as an organization within 26 different states. I'd add that, 29 states now have farmland protection programs that we consider that to be very much part of our legacy. And since 2020, we have distributed 250 grants to farmers and ranchers, and that's for about $5 million that has gone directly to producers to help them in their work. On the policy end, we've had successes in an exceptionally challenging environment. So we were part of the coalition that successfully pushed for, this can get very technical very quickly, but we pushed for the transfer of the Inflation Reduction Act conservation funding into the Farm Bill. This was something that was done over the summer. We had a lot of concerns that the Inflation Reduction Act funding had been basically locked up because of executive orders. And we'd long wanted this funding transferred to the Farm Bill because doing so allows it to actually increase what they call baseline. Every subsequent Farm Bill starts with a higher baseline for conservation funding because of this. And this was done in an incredibly partisan environment. So we've definitely had our fingerprints on some of the policy work that's been done too.
Thank you for all of that work. What do you think are the most important things for society to do to shift towards sustainable food, agriculture, and farming systems?
Well, from where I sit, fix or broken politics, but I think that's a subject for a different podcast. So I'll try to stay a bit more inside of our wheelhouse. I think we need a shift in mindset. We need to recognize that farmland is a finite resource. And I grew up taking farmland for granted. I grew up in Iowa. I was surrounded by farm fields, which I mistook as just open space awaiting development. But this land is the literal and figurative foundation of our nation. Farmland is a non-renewable resource, and we have to act like it. It seems kind of hyperbolic, but I don't think it is. Civilizations rise and fall based on how well they preserve their resources. And for all of our technology, I still think that remains true.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful note to end on. Thank you so much for this really informative interview, Tim, and for the amazing work that the American Farmland Trust is doing to help preserve American farmland. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary.